Good evening, good afternoon. Welcome back to High Top Sports Oregon. We got Derek the Duck with you, and we're hanging out. I'm on vacation, so a little bit different than the regular um, setup here. But hope you guys enjoy it. Might be a little bit of background noise, but it is what it is. Birds chirping. The gnats are incredibly bad. I'll be doing this all thing, but let's go ahead and get what we are talking about. Oregon Ducks top recruits for 2026. Go ahead and lock it down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Kendra Harrison, the number one tight end in this year's class out of North Carolina, I think that was a big one. Obviously, tight ends are kind of one of those premium positions where you only get maybe a handful of guys each class who kind of get that elite grade in recruiting, and Kendra is one of them. So massive news for the Ducks to lock that one down. I know, obviously when you get a 5-star that kind of commits to your program really early on in the cycle, you have to be a little bit weary of it just because, obviously they're going to take their visits and coaches aren't going to stop recruiting them just because they committed somewhere. But yeah, it's a massive chunk of news here that he shut his recruitment down. Focusing on the Ducks, like we mentioned previously, he'll be playing basketball for Dana Altman in this Duck basketball program as well. Really excited to get that one locked down.
Yeah, for sure. And talk about basketball. Florida Gators won national championship in basketball just the other week while we were gone away. Heck, you can't beat that though. Good for Florida. I know this isn't a Florida channel, but the main high top channel, we went absolutely berserk. I don't know if you guys saw it floating around Twitter, but may have been a couple bush lights deep and got a little cray cray.
Yeah, what the prof drinking Bush Lights? Call me crazy. I don't believe it, but yeah, man, I was really excited for it actually. To see the High Top family kind of being able to have their moment and enjoy a national championship, which something I hope we're able to enjoy someday in football here at Oregon. But yeah, I was really excited for you guys. It's kind of fun to watch your guys' journey and watch your guys' live streams and such. And obviously, giving Shelton a little shit when Florida was struggling a little bit, I always enjoyed that too. But yeah, really happy for the Gators.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to our next topic. Portal giveth, the portal taketh. Let's go ahead. I know, again, this is an Oregon channel, but I think this is a precedent that we need to talk about. Obviously, everybody has had time to weigh in and think about it and see how they feel. Before we get into any of the Oregon stuff, Nico, I'm leaving you now instead of leaving you later. Decides to hop in the portal, and it seems like he may not have a place to go, is what we're looking at.
Yeah, that kind of seems to be the reality of the situation. I mean, it's kind of the flip side of the game you play. If you want to hold out and try to go get your coin elsewhere, I understand it in today's day and age with NIL. These players obviously they want to make sure they're protected and set up for the future as well. And obviously, if they have an opportunity to make more money, that's something they're going to think about. However, with that being said, you do run the risk of running into a situation kind of like we're seeing with Nico in this current moment, where he went from being a very, very, very highly touted 5-star recruit at the premium position of a quarterback, obviously gets to Tennessee. We're just getting reports that there was a little turbulence, once the college football playoff kind of arrived for Tennessee, where Nico threatened to sit out if they didn't restructure his NIL deal, which this is all of a sudden it's starting to sound a whole lot like the NFL preseason with guys starting to hold out and trying to get contract restructuring and negotiations done. But at the very same time, I really don't like what it's doing for college football. In this regard, NIL, I'm a full supporter of it. I understand it, makes sense to me. However, I do think there needs to be regulations in it for this very reason right now. Because the very reality of this for Nico is he doesn't have a place to go now. We got reports from On3 last night that these programs who we thought were in the Nico sweepstakes are kind of pulling themselves out until his NIL package starts
Drops.
to diminish a little bit. Yeah, where they don't have to pay him quite as much, which that makes total sense. But you're going from leading a Tennessee program who, was very prominent all year, obviously made a college football playoff, to all of a sudden, you're searching for another program. And some of these names we see popping up, like the UCLA's, Tulane, they've been a wonderful G5 program over the last couple of years, but, we we're just lying to ourselves if we say there's not a massive drop off from, what you're able to do at Tulane compared to what you're able to do at some of the upper echelons of the SEC. So I'm really interested to see how this Nico situation plays out. I'm not necessarily mad he did it. However, now that he's dealing with some of the consequences of making that decision, I'm fine with that as well. He's gonna have to kind of pay for his actions at this point.
Yeah, and the biggest thing too is questioning with Nico. I mean, did you burn your bridge at Tennessee? I mean, just because he's in the portal doesn't mean he has to go. But how? I mean, if you bring him back, I mean, you got to think that it makes you question um, as a player. You're like, is this cat all in?
Oh, 100%. How do you, especially like what I said, the quarterback, obviously, typically that's the captain of your offense for obvious reasons. But how do you take that player on your team who led your program to a college football playoff, kind of starting to bring them back to prominency a little bit again, and then he decides to just dip out. All of a sudden, we're looking at it where there's a potential he could come back, but how is that received in the locker room? How do those guys who are sticking with the Tennessee program and have bought into Heupel's, hype over there at Tennessee, how do those guys react to Nico coming in after saying basically, the dollar amount is greater than the program itself, which is something Coach Heupel, he kind of addressed too. He said, no one's greater than our logo, which I love that for the program. I don't expect a program to kind of diminish and bend its morals for a player um, like Nico even. I don't know, man. It's a really turbulent situation, and I have a feeling this is very, very far from done. And I have a feeling until we kind of get some NIL regulations in college football, I don't think this will be the last time we see an instance similar to this.
Yeah, for sure. Let's go ahead and talk about Oregon portal entries. Um, Obviously, there's some needs, right, that you would like to go see him get. Pretty loaded team though. I mean, you're probably like what, a player or two, maybe just for some depth. Um, but let's think about some kids that may be forced to go into the portal for Oregon. Who are you thinking?
Sure. I mean, the first one, obviously, this is one where it makes a lot of sense. People aren't going to like to hear it, and nor am I saying it's going to happen. It just makes a lot of sense that this could be a very real option. Is Austin Novosad jumping in the portal in the spring? You know, if it's one of those things where he truly could go start at a decent little handful of P4 conference programs,
Tulane.
I'm not sure. Right. Well, I mean, just in general, I mean, there are a number of P4 schools out there who could use a quarterback, and I don't know how beneficial it is for him to stay at Oregon at this point, especially if we have another year of Dante Moore ahead of us, right? If he doesn't end up declaring they preserved his red shirt last year for a reason, if we have another year of Dante Moore, how much sense does it make to even for an Austin Novosad to even stay with the Oregon roster? And that's not me talking ill against Oregon nor Austin Novosad. It's just the reality of the situation where if you have two players in that quarterback room who could realistically lead a program, and your ultimate goal is to get to the NFL and kind of have some of that exposure, how much sense does it make for you to stick around in a program and, see limited action and get limited exposure, albeit at a great program? So Austin Novosad is a name. I know I said it last year, and I'm going to rebound and say it again this year. I think there's a very real chance we see his name enter the portal. I could see him going back to some of those Texas schools, as he is from Texas originally. But like I said, there are a number of P4 programs who, if they had a serviceable quarterback hit the portal, people are going to be calling. So first and foremost, he's kind of the one I'm most intrigued for moving forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also I'm also gonna say this. Obviously, like I said, Oregon, not in a spot where you got to rebuild the whole team. It's not FSU where you're trying to rebuild the whole team. What are we thinking coming into to Oregon? Is there a player? I know I saw like the edge from Liberty hopped in the portal yesterday. He seems like a pretty good pickup. I saw a couple of defensive backs. No linebackers yet that I know of. I know that's a circled spot. But where do you think they go and go get a portal player? What position?
I think overall Oregon's going to be pretty. sedentary in the portal. I don't think they're gonna make a lot of splashes. Obviously, we're gonna have some guys who are gonna have to hit the portal in the spring just for sheer scholarship numbers. Not necessarily anything to be panicked about. I think if there's one position though where if, and that's a big if, somebody who makes sense, fits the scheme, kind of has all the tools that they're looking for. I think it is at that linebacker position. And I know you just kind of mentioned here that the linebackers in the portal currently are it's a thin group to say the least. The portal officially opens tomorrow, so I have a feeling we're going to see some more entrants tomorrow. But I think if the price was right, you find the right guy who buys into the right message, wants to be an Oregon Duck. I don't think Oregon's going to look at him and turn him away. And that kind of goes for any position group. Say you have an edge, one of these elite positions where realistically Oregon's probably going to be just fine this year. But if you have someone calling who you can't say no to, you kind of got to at least make a call and see what's happening. Um, but I could see it where Oregon maybe adds a player, maybe two, if like I said, if the price is right. But I think if they're looking for a focal point or a point of emphasis in the spring portal, it's absolutely in that linebacker room. Bryce Betcher comes back, Devin Jackson comes back, which is a great one too, but the depth behind those two, it's a little bit unproven. Not saying these guys can't play. It's just, what they've been able to put on the field is very limited. And that kind of makes the fan base a little bit nervous for obvious reasons.
For sure. And what could be good too is if you get a guy from like Louisiana Monroe, or you get a guy from like Liberty or a smaller school that's
Mm.
maybe a junior that's just looking for an extra little boost of playing time, and he's got set the school record in tackles, or 15 sacks over the last 2 years, and 300 tackles or whatever. That's kind of the player that you're really looking to go get, right?
Mm. Oh, absolutely. And I think, if there's a player out there who's, say he's got 3 years of eligibility left and has very limited exposure on the field, it doesn't make sense to bring those caliber of players in at this point, just given what you've
You got
recruited. You
those.
and yeah, correct. Because then in reality, what you're doing is you're looking at the development of this person to be able to plug and play them into your program anyway. And the reality of the situation is you already have those athletes in this room. So it doesn't really make sense to stack, projects on top of each other and just see what sticks. So I think you're absolutely right. I think if there is a player that hits the portal and his numbers and productivity are just something you can't look away from, the price is right. I think they're going to push for it a little bit, especially in that linebacker room. But overall, I don't see Dan and the Ducks being incredibly active in the spring portal compared to what we've seen out of the winter portal the last couple of years.
All right, let's go ahead. Let's talk about some Ducks leading in the 2026 class. Um, right now, hey, you need an offensive lineman? It just popped on Twitter. Um, Ducks leading in the 2026 class for some seriously high caliber recruits. Nothing that we haven't seen from Dane Lanning and company. Now, we've had a couple flips to USC. Are we worried about that? Or I know that class is going to fall apart. I've seen it 3 years in a row. The early summer, the early spring, classes. I think they go number one in the spring every year. USC does, and then none of those kids make it on campus.
Yeah, I mean, if it's any indication of what we've seen over the last 2 years, you can fully expect that there are some bigger name recruits in their current class who are going to decommit and flip and do X, Y, and Z. One thing I will give USC though is I think they're really starting to recruit the West Coast a little bit better, as opposed to trying to go out and get some of these guys out of the Georgias, the Floridas, the Virginias, some of these East Coast schools. Obviously, it's difficult to get a recruit to come from the East Coast to about as far west as you can possibly go. So USC, I think they've kind of prioritized a little bit more focusing on California, which obviously, as we know, as Oregon Duck fans, that's a hotbed for Oregon, has been for the last couple of years. Um, the very same reason why we're seeing USC contend and flip some of our recruits that come out of California. Am I worried about it? I would say no. And it's not something where I'm just like, oh, USC. No, I'm not worried. It's just I have so much faith in Dan Lanning when it comes to recruiting and kind of what he's going to be able to bring on campus that it's so hard to panic when I see USC do these things right now. I should look at USC in their number one class and be a little worried. Are they back? I'm not though. And it's not because I don't have confidence in USC necessarily. It's just one of those things where I have so much more confidence in Dan Lanning and kind of what he's trying to do at Oregon and how he recruits that it's not something I really think about. Do I like seeing USC recruit well? Obviously not. If I could watch them go 0 and 12 every year, would love it. Um, that's not the reality of the situation, and honestly, it's kind of good for the West Coast in general to have USC and Oregon kind of battling it out a little bit. Have two of those. I'm not going to call USC a premier program at this point, but two of those bigger name programs on the West Coast kind of being able to be staples.
Okay, and then let's go ahead and get into some of these prospects that are leaning kind of towards the Ducks very early. It's still springtime, but this 2026 class, it's going to wrap up quick. It'll be
Hmm.
done before you know it. Obviously, probably going to be a big hotbed is the spring game coming the 26th of this month. We will talk about that at the very end, but that's always a big recruiting weekend if you can get the guys on campus for that. But what are you feeling? What are you feeling in Duck Nation and some of the targets that they're kind of leaning towards?
Yeah, I mean, where we sit right now, I know Oregon fans have been pretty vocal that things have been quiet for Oregon in the recruiting world as of recently, and it kind of amplifies it a little bit, especially when you see USC. It seems like every other day they have someone committing to their program or flipping from another program. So it can be a little bit discouraging, I think, for Duck fans to kind of see that and wondering why Oregon isn't ramping it up. At this point, USC already has over 20 commits to this class, which, damn well could be a full class. When Oregon, I think, is sitting at 13 as we shoot the show right now. So Oregon's got some work to do. But I really, really like where they stand, kind of moving forwards for some of these top recruits. Obviously, Jackson Cantwell being the biggest one. He is the number one overall recruit in the nation right now in this 2026 class out of the state of Missouri, at a premium position at that offensive tackle. And, just recently he announced that he'll be making his commitment a little bit sooner than we had previously expected, which will be coming, in a handful of weeks here. And then the bigger development followed just very shortly after that, where Jackson Cantwell, he's taking one more visit, one official visit, and that is to Oregon right before he commits. And kind of, he was kind of quoted as saying he wants to make sure that the program is what he thought it was, and he wants to fully understand what he's getting into and be on campus for the first time to see some of these spring practices, engage, and kind of what that looks like. Um, but the Duck fans should be pretty excited about that one. I feel pretty good about where we sit for Jackson Cantwell. Um, being the number one recruit in the nation at one of those premium positions, even if he puts on that Duck hat and then, in a couple of weeks, it's going to be one of those things where this recruitment, until he says otherwise, is going to be pretty turbulent until the very end. It's always that way with offensive tackles. So, we saw it recently with Jordan Seaton in his class when, there was a lot of smoke to Oregon and Miami. He ultimately went to Colorado and he was kind of all over the board. But Oregon sits in a really good position for him. And as of recently, Emmanuel Ihenacho, the number two offensive tackle in the nation out of the state of Maryland, just recently took his visit to Oregon, and it was just recently reported by On3 that they are supposedly the new leaders. Maryland kind of slid into that number two spot. So currently, as we sit right now, if you ask the quote unquote experts, Oregon's sitting in the driver's seat for the number one and two offensive tackles in this class. And that's not to consider that Oregon already has 5-star offensive tackle Cody Green in this class out of the state of California. So I think the odds, realistically, that Oregon signs those three are pretty slim just because of, sheer need and desirability from some of these other programs to get these guys. But I really, really, really like where Oregon sits for these three offensive lineman prospects. And if you can get two out of these three, that would be a massive win for this class at one of these, like I said, a premium position.
For sure, for sure. Obviously, spring game coming up. We just talked about maybe some possible recruits coming. What are you looking
Mm.
forward to seeing in the spring? I know that um, it is one of those things where they keep it pretty vanilla, don't show much. But who are you looking to have a big day for the spring game? And hats off to Oregon for even having one. because it just seems to trend that spring games are no longer important. I don't know where people get that idea from, or they're scared of getting their players poached or what have you. But what do you think
Mhm.
on that about them just having a spring game, and then what are you looking forward to seeing at the spring game?
Yeah, first and foremost, I'm really excited that Oregon's having a spring game. I understand some fans' perspective where it's not obviously it's not the same as playing a Saturday in September. When you have another opponent on the other side of the field and the game means more. However, the spring game means a lot for a lot of people, especially in Oregon. Where there's not an abundance of professional sports and high caliber sports. So the spring game is massive for a number of reasons. For the fans, it's massive. Obviously, it's a wonderful opportunity for them to kind of engage with the program a little bit and, interact with some players and coaches and just kind of get to see a little more than what they're used to from the media access. Um, for players' perspective, I really like it. Dan brought up a good point in one of his recent interviews where, the spring game gives a lot of families an opportunity to see these guys play on a field where they might not really get a lot of opportunities. You got to think about like walk-ons, even some of these scholarship guys who throughout their career they're just never quite able to break through and make the next step and turn into a starter. They're getting that opportunity to play on Autzen Stadium. They're getting the opportunity to play in front of their family, and I think that's really cool. I like that for them. For the university itself, I don't think the spring game's ever going to go away as long as Dan Lanning's the head coach. The spring game for the last, I don't even know how many years, has been the biggest recruiting event for Oregon in the springtime for a number of years. And once again, it's going to be that way again this year. There are a number of 5-star prospects from this 26 class, a number of 5 stars from the 27 class. We even have a 5-star from the 28 class who will be there. Um, I think it's great for the university to have the spring game. Great for fans to kind of get to see for the first time some of these new faces in an Oregon uniform. For myself personally, I'm really excited to kind of see what the development of Dante Moore looked like. Obviously, we know we're not going to get a full playbook. It's a very vanilla, it's very cookie cutter offense, defense, just trying to get some exposure, getting some live reps in front of fans. That's more so what it's about. But I am excited to kind of see how he navigates, see what the ball looks like coming out of his hands. Absolutely, for one. For two, I think, if you're an Oregon fan whatsoever, Decorian Moore has got to be someone you are absolutely ecstatic to see. It's a name, it seems like every other day we're getting highlights and just praise from various coaches and what he's able to do in practice and the small blips of what we've been able to see from the media access to practice, which as we know Oregon doesn't typically allow. We've gotten to see some really exciting stuff from the true freshman. So I'm really excited to see what he looks like on the game field. See him running the game speed, what he's able to do with his hands. And then just kind of in general, it's a lot on the defense. I'm really excited to see um, some of the new faces on the defense. Obviously there was a massive turnover in our secondary in terms of what our starters are going to look like. I'm really excited to see that. Um, the safety room is one I'm really, really excited about. I think Oregon has a tremendous amount of depth. With the Purdue transfer, with just Kingston Lopa is a name I'm really excited for. Just a massive dude in terms of frame. Um, Aaron Flowers is someone who, Oregon fans were clamoring over his commitment when that had happened. I'm excited to see him get some action. We've heard a lot of good things out of him. And then finally, that defensive line. I know if you go back to last year and watch our show from a year ago at this time, I'm probably saying the same exact thing. We had a lot of question marks in that defensive line. We didn't know, was Derek Harmon going to take that next step? He did. Was Jamare Caldwell able to maintain that production? He was. Jordan Birch obviously came back. He was able to do what he was able to do. Um, but I'm excited to see the continued emergence of Mateo on the edge. I think when all is said and done in his Oregon career, I think there's a very real possibility he's a first to second round pick. Really excited to see the development and the leadership out of him. And then a lot of these just young guys in this defensive line group. There's a lot of names in this defensive line room who Oregon fans have seen through recruiting, just heard about frequently over the last couple of years. And we've never really gotten to see him in game action because you have first round picks like the Derek Harmons or even the mid round picks Jamare Caldwell, Jordan Birches. It was really hard to crack that um, that playing time role. And I think we're going to get to see a good glimpse of kind of how those guys move on the field for the first time and, kind of put the image what we're reading from all these articles and such. So I'm really excited to see. everything, really. I mean, I'm just really excited to have some Oregon Duck football back, even for one day.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good time. I actually went to Gainesville for the Orange and Blue game. Great time. Um, got to meet some players. Met Coach Billy Napier. Um, Knew who I was. That was kind of cool. So I
Yeah,
thought,
and that's kind of what I'm saying. It's like it's even for the fans' perspective. I mean, this is not an opportunity you typically get. Say we're talking a mid-October game on a Saturday. You're not getting
no.
access like this. You're not getting to have conversations and take these icons and turn them into real people and have a real conversation with them. Like these are the kind of unique opportunities the spring game affords. Just like I saw how much you enjoyed yours. There's a ton of Oregon fans who are going to enjoy it the same way, and that's the reason I'm happy. Some of these programs, like the Floridas, like the Oregons, they say, no, we're going to keep playing that spring game. I love it, to be real honest.
Yeah, and it's gonna be interesting to see. These guys that didn't have spring games. There's gonna be a microscope on them week one, and if they look sloppy, they're gonna point straight to that. So, I personally didn't like that teams were opting out, because it brings players and kids, and it's free. I mean, tickets for these games are just absolutely through the roof, unless you're playing,
Hmm.
Mercer or whatever, the School of the Blind. You can't afford you
Yeah,
can't afford a Oregon USC game or a Oregon Washington game. Good luck trying to get tickets for it. So it's good.
right.
It's good to breed new ducks into the program. The young kids get to get signatures and stuff like that. It's good for the players, because you're going to go buy those NIL jerseys after you meet them, and stuff like that. So it's a win all around. And if you're not having a spring game, I think it's a detriment to your program.
I do too. I really don't understand this whole like. I think it started with Matt Rule in Nebraska, where he's like, our players got poached after last year's spring game. A couple things here. First off, if these players it's that easy to poach them to another program, how bought into your program were they really? You know what I mean? Like, if it's truly that easy to just jump ship, buy into a whole new system, buy into a whole new ideology, a whole new coach, a whole new city, state, school, everything. How much were they really bought into that program? In the spring portal, we're not seeing where these just massive names are jumping into the portal after they have a great performance in the spring. That's just not the reality of the situation. I think for USC, I can understand it a little bit more just because of like, kind of like we talked about earlier, the last at a minimum 3 years, their class is absolutely disintegrated once we hit spring. We're seeing guys flip to the Georgias and, decommit and go back into the recruitment phase and X, Y, and Z. That makes sense to me. Lincoln Riley can't hold on to a recruit to save his life. Programs like Oregon, for say, it's not something I worry about. It's you don't think I know that there are going to be programs calling DeCorian Moore someday and saying, "Hey, you know, if you look this way, we might be able to slide you a little something." These things are going to happen. This is college football. It's just how are you able to hold on to them? And I think that's what Dan's logic on it is too. He's like, we want the players who are bought into this program. Something he stresses day in and day out. And if strictly having a little bit of exposure and getting a little bit of attention from somewhere else is enough to make you go, then by all means, be on your way.
For sure. And what Florida did, I thought was very smart. They had about 98% of their NIL packages done this year before the spring game. So if a kid balled out, it doesn't matter. They're there. They're locked in.
Yeah, that's incredibly smart. It makes so much sense to me, and I have a feeling we're gonna see more stuff like what Florida's doing. I think they're kind of like that's a great model for how I think college football in general is gonna try to you know delegate things a little bit. I think eventually, I'm not saying this year, I'm not saying next year. I think there's gonna be a time where we see the spring portal has a very hard date. I think like before the spring games start, I think that's going to be it. Once that date passes, there's no more entries. Or if you want to enter, you go back to the old NCAA ways where you're sitting out a year. Like that's what it is. So I like what Florida did there. I like it kind of nixing that whole NIL talk. I think that's great. Kind of putting it out in the forefront and just saying, hey, let's talk about it. I like that a lot. And I think that's a great way to keep your players. And I have a feeling we're not going to see a mass exodus happen when the spring portal opens for Florida because they're able to take care of their players.
For sure. And I know that it's not gone through yet, but they are voting on getting rid of the spring portal in general. We will be down to a one portal season, which I think is probably best for college football at this point. You don't lose your starting quarterback in the spring, and it's one of those things where um, that it just lets a little bit of fear off the coaches. They can kind of focus on roster retention and what they need to be doing in the spring, getting guys healthy, and instead of every time they turn around and a kid makes a play, you got to go drop another bag to them. That's unrealistic. I understand the universities make a lot of money, but it's not a blank check. Nobody has a
Hmm.
blank check. And the joke at Oregon is Phil Knight, Phil Knight, Phil Knight. Well, you got to understand there's only so much liquid that Phil Knight can liquidate to pay these players. It's not like the guy has, gold bars that he's just slinging around. Like I know what he's worth, but it's not all liquid. That's not how that works.
No, and I see, and that's the thing that really cracks me up about, especially fans who were like they don't really care to look into it at all. They just see an Oregon commit and they're dropping a dollar sign emoji or whatever the case is. Like I think people think that Oregon sees a recruit they want. So say like a Decorian Moore last year. They see the number one wide receiver in the country. I think they think Dan calls Phil and says, "Hey, pay him as much as he wants to come here." That's just how recruiting is done now. And I don't think that could be farther from the truth, to be real honest. Like, is there an element to that? Most definitely. No matter where he went, he was getting paid. That's not what I'm arguing at all. But Oregon doesn't have this just massive endless pit of NIL funds. It's not how it works. And if you look at the NIL distribution, it's not coming from Nike directly. It's not coming from Phil Knight. A lot of these NIL packages are coming from, Oregon's internal thing, like Division Street is a great one, um, where they're able to, kind of make their presence felt, or, there's just a number of small things or small individual deals, and there's so much that goes into NIL. And I would love people to understand it's not just one man who has a ton of money writing blank checks to these high school kids so they come play for their program for a couple of years. Like that is not what recruiting is. I see how some people can kind of get wrapped up in it, but that's just not the reality of the situation.
For sure, and these multimillionaires and billionaires are not that they don't become that because they're dumb and they're writing endless checks. I mean, they're smart with their money, right? And it's just not feasible to do that. So, but we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up. I want to thank Derek the Duck. We're back on High Top Sports Oregon. Gonna be producing a bunch of content for you guys. Sorry for the little bit of a thing. Hey, it's been extremely busy. We had vacation. I'm on vacation, and obviously the Florida Spring Game and the High Top Original Channel. We've been cranking out content, but me and Derek the Duck will be back on it. Thanks, Derek, for coming along. Any last words?
No, just really exciting. Duck fans, buckle up. I think it's going to be a pretty exciting couple weeks in recruiting. So really, really looking forward to that.
For sure, for sure. And then obviously the spring game, we will be covering that. Can't wait to see that televised. I'm gonna definitely be taking some notes on some players that I think have a big day. But I'm Cody, the professor with High Top Sports Oregon. There's Derek the Duck, and we will see you later.